Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our program of conversations ahead of Art Basel Hong Kong opening this coming week with a special focus on the Art Basel and UBS Art Market Report, which we will explore today with a particular focus on the Asia-Pacific region. We'll begin this talk with a special presentation by Dr. Clare McAndrew, author of the Art Market Report, who's kindly put together a few interesting facts and figures for our esteemed panel to chew on. And we're honored to welcome Elaine Kwok, modern and contemporary art expert and auctioneer, who's joining Hauser & Wirth this summer as managing partner Asia. Emmy Yu, executive director of STPI, a leading contemporary art space in Singapore and the driving vision behind SEA Focus. Adrian Zuercher, head of global asset allocation and co-head global investment management, APAC, at the UBS Chief Investment Office in Hong Kong. And today this talk is moderated by Aaina Bhargava, arts and culture editor at Tatler Asia. So thank you very much to our panel for joining us. And to our audiences, a few housekeeping notes. We have simultaneous translation into Mandarin. You can choose your preferred audio channel at the bottom of your screen. And there you're also going to find the Q&A function, which we recommend you use. Feel free to drop any questions that you have, and we'll be monitoring it throughout the talk, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can towards the end of the conversation. So please don't forget to drop those questions in good time. And without further ado, there's so much to talk about. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us. And the floor is yours.
Thanks. I'll start out. I was going to present a few findings from the AMR that we launched earlier this year. I wanted to take a quick look at what's been happening around the world, and particularly in Asia. It's obviously been a really eventful couple of years, a very challenging period. The art market and the businesses within it have had to adapt to a lot of changing circumstances, some slow burners and some completely unforeseen ones. And obviously, it's been a bit of a kind of a volatile period for sales. And just on the first slide, if we move forward, you can see that in 2020, it was obviously one of the biggest recessions in the market in 10 years. But the market recovered really strongly in 2021. So it came back to just over 65 billion. Sales were up by 29%. And so we basically recouped the losses of 2020 and just a little bit higher than 2019 as well. And it was a good year for the dealer sector. Auctions did even better. And regionally, most regions performed pretty well. Some of the bigger Asian economies, art economies, performing particularly well. Just on the next slide, something that really helped the market recover was the wealth effects of this crisis. And we flagged this a few times for the last couple of years' research, that the wealth effects are very different. And if you look at the very top of the pyramid at billionaire wealth, you can see the wealth effects are really different from, say, for example, the global financial crisis, when billionaire wealth dipped by 45%. In 2020, billionaires their wealth went up by about a third, and then last year again by a further 20%. And even within that billionaire segment, it's the wealth at the very, very top of the pyramid, if you like, that's been getting better. So the top 10 billionaires last year, for example, their wealth went up by about 40% versus everybody else by about 16%. So it's really driving, it helped to the high end of the art market particularly recover. And just on the next slide, you can see a few of the differences by region as well. Asian billionaires now account for about 1/3 of billionaire wealth. So it's still slightly less than the US, but it's been growing at a phenomenal rate at the top end of Asian wealth. I'm sure Adrian might have some things to say about that later. But you can really see in the period between December 2020 and 21, there was some really strong growth in different parts of Asia and Asia Pacific. India, Australia, Vietnam, all these regions really grew at an above average rate of this very top end wealth. Japan is a funny one. That actually brought the average for Asia down a bit in terms of billionaire wealth growth, but it's an unusual case because it's one of the most balanced economies in terms of wealth distribution. It's not as top heavy at all, but it really is this high net worth wealth helped the top end of the market recover a bit better and a bit quicker than perhaps it would have otherwise. Just taking a look at the regions on the next slide. as I said, most of the regions around the world saw an uplift in sales. The US did really well, was up by about a third and retained that dominant position. The biggest market by far in Asia is still China, and China saw really strong growth. It grew by about 35% year on year, and it moved into second place. It was joint second in the previous year. In 2021, it moved firmly into second position. And all of the bigger markets in Asia saw double-digit positive growth. So China, Japan, South Korea all recovered really well. And again, you've got to be careful because these are comparing things to 2020. So it's still, rather than when you see double-digit growth, it's tempting to think things are rocketing away. But I mean, it's where it comes from. The benchmark was pretty low in 2020, but still very, very positive picture for Asia. And particularly if you compare it to Europe, which was a bit more sluggish. The EU did pretty well. France had an amazing year, up by about 50%, one of its strongest years ever, but the UK was a little bit more sluggish and it moved back into third place. It still grew by about 14%, but it had a lot of things going on between COVID and Brexit and a lot of other things going on. So Asia significantly outperforming Europe in 2021. Just looking at the different segments of the market on the next slide, the dealer sector recovered well. Dealer sales overall were up about 18%. Still a little bit below 2019, so we're 34.7 billion, but a big improvement on the previous year. And I think there was a lot of optimism that this change and the pandemic and the big shift to online that we've seen might help to rearrange the hierarchies in the dealer sector a little bit. But actually, as sales picked up again, and we saw the momentum coming back into the market, we saw that really didn't happen. And again, it tended to be, you can see very clearly on this chart that it's the higher end that tended to perform better last year. Now they did do worse in 2020, but it's definitely the strongest growing dealer segment was that between 5 and 10 million. And the worst performing, the smallest uplift was the smallest dealers. And actually, if you break down that under 250,000 category again into under 100,000, they actually saw a fall in sales year on year. So those divides are still very present in the market. Just looking by region on the next slide, some of the dealers from Asia actually had the biggest increase in sales. They seem to be a little bit more ahead of the curve in some way in terms of the recovery. This is China had particularly strong growth. This is combining mainland China and Hong Kong, but Asia as a whole, you can see they're performing certainly much better than Europe and also in many regions better than the US. So a very strong year in terms of recovery in Asia for the dealer sector. Just on the next slide, I think what we're all focusing on is, and what we were wondering what would happen in 2021 was, what would happen when the fair calendar started to kick back in? Would we just switch back from online and would, everyone start going back to fairs again? And this, I suppose, is a question we're still really grappling with this year is where will this kind of play out? And if you look at 2021, fair sales accounted for 29% of the value of dealer sales. That was a little bit lower in Asia, 22%. But if you include, 21%, but if you look at art fair OVRs, you can see in Asia, these were much more important than the global average. So art fair OVRs accounted for 6% of sales in Asia versus 2% globally. And that this is an interesting point that some of the panelists might have some kind of insights on, because it's real mixed views when you talk to dealers, and both in the surveys and when I was talking to people for the report on how successful these were. A lot of people thinking they were necessary, but not necessarily that successful for them, but a higher proportion of Asian dealers making sales through that channel. And that affects the share online. If you look at the chart, online sales in Asia accounted for 22%, but if you include art fair OVRs in that section of online, it's 28%. So that's higher than globally. So online sales in Asia were 28% when you include OVRs versus 22% globally. So more sales being made online in Asia last year than they were elsewhere. I think on the next slide, this just shows you the summary. I suppose this is the real picture of what happened. Okay, we all know fair sales plummeted in 2020 because events just didn't happen and online sales grew. And we've seen in 2021, fair sales did come back a bit and online sales did shrink a bit, but we're still nowhere near the picture that was in 2019 in the first column. And this is, I think, something that we're going to be really looking at, seeing how this plays out in the next few years. But I think a lot of dealers certainly were telling me that some of these changes they do see as more permanent. The shift to to more online sales was certainly a knee-jerk reaction at first, but once they've been invested in the infrastructures and the marketing programs and all the other online strategies, they're going to keep these up. Now, it might be in parallel with offline strategies, and everybody's saying they're working kind of twice as hard because they've got both tracks running at the same time. But I think these are interesting changes that we're going to see develop significantly over the next few years. Just on the next slide, I think this really brings out the importance of online. Obviously when sales plummeted in 2020, despite that, online sales, this is aggregating dealers and auction houses, had their strongest year ever. They doubled in value to 12.4 billion, despite the drop in sales. And even in 2021, even though that did shrink, even though dealers and auction houses made a little bit less share of their sales online, online sales still grew because of the growth in the market, but by a much more reasonable 7% year on year to 13.3 billion. And it's interesting because the art market has now definitely caught up with general retail. It was always kind of behind other industries in terms of how much they sold online. It shot ahead in 2020, and now they're more or less on par. So around 20% of sales in the art market made online. So it's an interesting kind of catch-up phenomenon that's happened. And just on the next slide, I suppose the auction sector has always been a little bit ahead maybe of the gallery sector in terms of selling online, and the auction sector had a phenomenal year in 2021. There were already well-established online sales, and actually the most successful format of last year was probably the live stream sale that we were all kind of watching with interest, where there was a live event and kind of an online format streamed around the world, this kind of slightly hybrid format, if you like. They were among the most successful, but a really strong year at auction. Sales at public auction increased by 47%, and private sales up by about a third as well. So a very strong year in the auction sector, a combination, I suppose, of people maybe holding things back that they didn't want to sell, they didn't think it was a good market in 2020, but also new buyers. And if you look at the big auction houses, especially, really successful in engaging with new buyers. If you look at the next slide, it just really shows this high end that I was talking about with high net worth wealth. This kind of line at the top is sales for over 10 million, and you can really see how it's been so influential in what happens to the market sales at that level. But you can really see last year that really shot up. And this is just an index of sales from 2005. And this segment had one of its highest points ever. That index for the 10 million plus segment went from 100 in 2005 to 1200 in 2021. Whereas if you look at the, say, sub 50,000 sector, that went from 100 to 129. So two very different trajectories of growth going on, and the high end really, really influential in boosting sales. And just on the next slide, obviously it just shows how important Asia is in the auction sector. I mean, China is the biggest auction market in the world, ahead of the US last year. There's an even wider margin in previous years. And the impact is not just where sales take place, but also buyers, where buyers are from at auction. And if you look at, I think the three large multinationals are always a really good yardstick to measure global buying. If you look at the combined sales of Christie's, Sotheby's and Phillips, 28% of their sales in 2021 went to Asian buyers. So that's still a little bit behind the US, was 36, but ahead of Europe, which was 25%. That's Europe, EU, including the UK. So Asian buying and selling, really an very important part of the auction sector. And we really saw this in the collector surveys we did with UBS. I've got a summary of some of the findings on the next slide. I've been doing these surveys with UBS Investor Watch over the last 6 years. It's some really fascinating research, and we're really building on some interesting findings and tracking markets. Last year we got responses from 2,000 high net worth collectors over 10 different regions. And it's been amazing to see that despite everything that's been going on, how much spending is going on in this kind of high net worth top section of the market. Median spending, you can see this is the middle spending of the group of people we surveyed, rose consecutively each year from 2019 to 2020, and in 2021 was nearly 3 times the level that it was in 2019. So not just better than 2021, wasn't just better than 2020 mid-pandemic, it was also better than 2019. And you can really see here mainland China, the highest median spend of all of the markets, and also showing that pattern of increasing year on year to 2019, 2020, 2021. Same in Hong Kong, same in Singapore. Taiwan, a little bit more subdued, but more or less stable spending down a tiny bit in 2020 and 21. So some interesting patterns there emerging. And the next one just shows a similar picture again of the share of collectors in this group spending over $1 million. And it's amazing that the share of collectors overall, these 10 markets, grew from 15% of people spending more than $1 million in 2019 to 34%. And if you look at mainland China, again, really a standout finding there, 44% of the collectors we surveyed in mainland China had spent over $1 million last year on art and antiques. It's amazing the share of people spending at that level. What are they spending their money on? Is this on the next slide? Some of the traditional mediums, paintings, sculptures, works on paper, photography, prints, multiples, they're still the dominant mediums for people to spend their money on and collect. But there was a huge interest last year and a lot of attention drawn to digital art. And you can see here 11% of spending last year over all of the markets was on digital art. There's obviously a huge focus there with the interest in NFTs has really drawn people's attention towards the digital art sector. And there was a small number of young collectors, particularly around 5% of Gen Z and millennials had spent over $1 million on digital art last year. So that's a small but significant finding that we're going to be tracking over the next few years. You can see it regionally just on the next slide. Digital art hasn't made as much of an impact in, say, mainland China and Hong Kong, but I think a really interesting finding was Singapore there. It was a kind of a standout market in terms of the amount spent on digital art, 17%, by far the highest overall. So again, really interesting dynamics and ones that we're going to be keeping an eye on over time. And just my last slide just shows intentions for when we asked collectors at the end of the year what were their plans for 2022. There was really active plans. People were planning on buying and selling, and you can see here digital art still being a big focus. 56% of collectors overall planning to buy digital art this year. Mainland China and Hong Kong were about average, but 70% of collectors from Taiwan planning to buy a piece of digital art this year, and over 60% in Singapore. So digital art still drawing a lot of attention from different parts in Asia. And I think, overall, when we did these surveys in December and January, there was a lot of optimism. Collectors were planning to buy, sell, donate works. We traveled to art fairs. There was a lot of reasons to hope for a really positive year. I think, unfortunately, the last few years have shown us that so many things can happen in a short period of time that can change plans. And I think we've seen a lot of issues already in the first quarter of this year that are changing plans and changing the outlook. So it's definitely going to be another very interesting year to watch and track what's going on this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that very informative summary of your report. I think there's a lot to unpack just based off of that. So I'm just going to throw out my first question to the panel, which is building on a lot of what sort of Claire already covered. But what are the most notable observations in regard to the growth and changes in the Asian collector base, whether it's demographic related or spending levels and patterns? In terms of the demographics, I know there was like a lot that Claire covered, but also in terms of sort of the reasons behind why we're seeing these spending levels and patterns, such as like generational wealth yielding an increase in younger collectors, for instance.
I can start. So when I look at the collectors that I work with, I kind of break them into two segments. One is the kind of really masterpiece, blue chip, very, very high-end collectors. And then the rest, and then the other group is more, the newer ones that I've been working with are kind of the younger millennial collectors. I think for both sides, for the blue chip, I think the taste is, the trend, well, actually for both sides, the trend in recent years has been going towards more international art, towards artists of minority, women artists, etc. It's getting increasingly trend driven, which you would be surprised. You have the people who like the masterpieces, but even those, a lot of them are looking towards the younger, kind of trendier artists. With the younger collector base, the millennial ones, they're very much social media savvy, and very focused on what translates well on images on digital screens, whether it's traditional art or with digital art. So that is again something that we see. I think categories such as more traditional sort of art, traditional Chinese paintings, Chinese antiques, they've suffered a little bit. Sadly, for the younger collectors, there's this view that this is very much kind of almost like uncle and auntie's art, which makes it less sexy, less appealing. And as I think as time goes on, these might become an increasingly niche market. However, I do believe that as the market continues to mature and become more sophisticated, it will also become more diverse as collectors become more confident. One trend that I have always found quite interesting in the our economics report is how if you look at China, if you look at the whole world, auction versus dealer sales, roughly on an average year, maybe dealer would be 55%, auction 45% overall. It's just slightly larger than half, but it's close to half. Whereas if you look at the trend for Greater China, you'll see that auctions often more closer to 70% or 60% or 2/3 of the pie. There's really more people here in this area of the world that are buying at auction. And I think really that's driven by how many people here are still relatively new to the market, and the auction market is easier to navigate. It's the prices are transparent, the rules are clear, highest bidder wins. Whereas I think for the dealer market, people need more, how do you say, more confidence and more knowledge of their own taste, more experience with the art market to navigate. So in terms of trends that I see coming in the future years, I see as the whole markets grow, I'm not saying the auction market will become smaller, but the dealer market would increase so that the balance would be closer to what we see with the rest of the world.
If I can go after Elaine, I mean, I concur with Elaine, what she said about the rising of new buyers and collectors from the younger generation. I think one of the factors that contributes to this rise, or even the rise of Asian buyers and collectors in general from Clare's report, is that historically speaking, a lot of Asian buyers were kind of prohibited going into a market that is predominantly English spoken. And I think over COVID, having this access online where you don't have to really kind of talk to anyone, and that you can make your own decisions, especially on the auction portal, I think that really brought in a lot of kind of shy and, well, most of them shy buyers into this market, and then into the market, in the international market, because now during COVID, a lot of auction houses and also the galleries they ramped up their businesses online. So from continuing from that, I think that when I look at around here in Asia, the rise in the younger collectors, and there are two segments: those who have had wealth from the family, and those who have made money from tech industry. There are two streams of these buyers. And I was going to say, Claire, from your report, there was like 17%. I think it was, our chart was really high on that NFT or digital art. And I'm just wondering whether there was contribution from Metacoven. So, but we do know that even though Singapore is a very small country, there's a very heavy concentration of people who are investing or working in the sector of cryptocurrency. And I do think that this has a lot of impact onto the art market, because the new generation of collectors or buyers that I see are looking at, especially from this part of the region, in the new collectors, they're looking at art as an investment rather than, traditionally and historically speaking, we know that a lot of people who are buying art, annually, they really bought art because they love and passion of collecting art. But I do think that, I feel that the art is kind of merging into lifestyle as well in this new generation. And I do think that plays a heavy factor in the rise of the numbers.
I might just add, it's actually really interesting because there is quite different regional dynamics in the different markets in Asia from the surveys we've done. And Singapore as well was a lot more focused on new artists, mainland China on established artists. So there's those kind of things going on. And I think it's exactly what you say. If you look at the acceptance of buying online, again, I love when the stats actually match what people are saying as well, but there is a greater acceptance and even preference for buying online in 2021 in Asia. It was 30% or more, not in mainland China, but in Hong Kong and Singapore, particularly, a really higher acceptance of buying online. And it could be those things that you're saying, you know, simple as, you know, it's easier from a language perspective, it's easier, you know, for people. I think the auction houses were so successful last year in getting new buyers. And I think that's what the galleries have been missing with the fair program, perhaps not in full swing in the last couple of years, is that, you know, getting new people in and new young people in the auction sector has been hugely successful in the last few years. And that's what really boosted the sales up last year too.
It's maybe also a good reflection. I'm not coming from the art scene, but if I look actually at macroeconomic trends, it explains a lot what we just discussed and the trends we actually do see. If you think, I mean, Claire mentioned at the beginning, right? So China is creating and has created over the last few years 2 to 3 billionaires every single week. But these are more first generational entrepreneurs, and they're naturally probably a bit less experienced, also have less time to spend on the art scene. So what they're doing is basically buying old masters and spending basically their wealth on that, or buying traditional Chinese art. While we also are in a very interesting time. So we are probably experiencing one of the biggest wealth shift globally, as there's a large part of elderly entrepreneurs, first generation, which now is slowly starting to pass on maybe their wealth to the second generation and third generation. And these are trends are much more established, for example, in Singapore than in mainland China. And so they are younger generations. They have studied abroad, which are now going into the art market. We also see a lot of businesses or families exiting their traditional businesses. And so you suddenly have a less entrepreneurial background. You become basically someone that is looking after their wealth. And then usually in this generational perspective, there are more people that are looking into the nice life or the nice side of the life, looking into art, becoming more experienced out of that. I mean, we also see this in the statistic of our collectors of the survey. So you see, for example, in Singapore and in Hong Kong, the majority of the collectors actually have spent less than 10 years collecting. While if you look, for example, in Germany, France, UK, so more traditional markets, people are much longer, basically more than 50% has collecting for more than 10 years. And one interesting aspect as well, maybe also if I look at the panel here, I'm the only male participating. We also see that more females are actually becoming more experienced. And there's also more transition from wealth transition to females. That's also one reflecting. And we see more female entrepreneurs. I think from the period from the previous report to this report, female billionaires, the amount grew by 36%. So it's really quite an amazing amount, while we haven't seen the same growth for the male part. So we see that these parts also have started to become an impact. And I think for me, it's always a nice reflection on what's actually going on in global trends on the macro side. We see a lot also in the art market trend.
Oh, thank you. So this actually leads me to my next question, and just speaking of female collectors and also digital art. But obviously NFTs and I think digital assets and cryptocurrency, it's probably the most polarizing and divisive sort of topic, but also like the breakout trend of 2021 within the art world. But I don't know, Elaine, do you want to sort of speak more a little bit about your experience with NFTs?
Sure.
First.
Yeah. Learning about NFTs over the past year or two has been one of the most fascinating and frustrating and fun parts of my journey, of my art journey last year. You know, it's all of it is very, very new. I think there are very few people who can truly claim themselves to be NFT experts. I am certainly not one of them, and I'm learning as I go. But I do find that there are a few factors that go into play with the rise of NFTs. First is the idea of digital art and how that could be the next new frontier of artistic expression. So that goes to how works of art, you're trying to always find kind of the newest form of expression, the latest, greatest thing. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's also the idea of, well, there's also the cryptocurrency market and of its kind of very turbulent but spectacular rise over the past few years. I think a lot of the prices that we see, the really kind of eye-popping prices on NFTs have been paid for in cryptocurrency by people who bought them some time ago. So if you had to change them back to fiat money, it looks like a lot, but maybe it wasn't quite as much for the people who purchased it. So I think it is fascinating. It's so important to learn about it. And the only way you can learn about it or kind of learn about it is to have skin in the game. So I have, you know, even though my background is very much in traditional art, I have bought a few NFTs just to try and to go through the process of buying cryptocurrency, of opening, you know, so many different wallets and writing down my passwords, etc., being nervous about fraud, joining Discord, joining Twitter and all that. It is quite a handful and not really for the faint of heart. It's also very, very turbulent. So my personal view is, for someone like me, I am certainly not putting my retirement savings into this. However, I'm perfectly happy to, let's say, spend like a discretionary budget. Maybe instead of buying a handbag or going on a staycation, I'm going to buy an NFT instead so that I could experience this and talk about it with a little bit of knowledge. It's also, I think, valuing it. The whole approach on purchasing NFTs is very different from purchasing fine art. I think when it comes to buying art, we always say, buy what you love. You have to have an emotional connection with it. When NFTs, I find so much of it, especially when it comes to, there are many different projects, but to the projects that have done very well, such as CryptoPunks or Bored Ape, these are profile pic or PFP projects. These are, a lot of them are really about the project team and the community, as opposed to your kind of personal emotional connection with a monkey icon. So anyhow, all I'm saying is it's a really wild ride. I do feel that it will develop into something very interesting in the future. It might not be the way we know it now, but I do believe in watching and participating in the space. And, you know, remember the time when no one believed that people would buy t-shirt online or people would buy an iPhone online, and that all happens now. So who knows where the NFT world will take us.
Right, absolutely. Emmy, I'm just curious, what is, because you are in, I mean, you already talked about it a little bit, but, you know, being in Singapore, how are you seeing this sort of affect the local art community as well? Or I guess the digital art community?
I was going to say to Elaine, I would still go on staycation and buy handbag than buy NFT, because I've only managed to create Meta, I think it's called Meta Purse, right? The wallet. Okay, that's how far I got so far. But I know that in Singapore, particularly, there are a couple of galleries who are experimenting and working with their artists to create NFTs and drop it. So, and I know that there's an NFT artist who's based in Singapore whose clients are basically international. Sorry, I forgot the name of the artist, but so that's why I think that when you do a research, the activity in Singapore on digital RAM for digital art is really dynamic. For me, maybe perhaps because I've always been involved in traditional art making, and that's why it's taking really long time for me to wrap my head around. I have attended numerous webinars to understand what is NFT or blockchain, but I think my brain just doesn't work like that. I can't, somebody needs to help me like draw out everything. I'm more of a visual person. So if somebody can explain to me with drawings, perhaps I can understand it, but it is difficult.
I mean, you just gotta go buy one. I mean, I definitely struggled. I remember being on and calling my friend. I bought I think the first one was like a shipping one, and calling my friend Alan Lau, how do I open this wallet? Why is this website not loading? I mean, it is very troublesome.
Yes, I know. I'm ready. I'm getting myself ready. So when I created MetaPurse, because Shin-san from Kai Kai Kiki just emailed me like, hey, Emi-san, you know, do you want to, Murakami-san may release NFT soon, but I want to let you know, but you need to have this. And I was like, what is that? Can you help me?
Oh no, you missed it.
No. Yeah, I know I did. And then he goes, oh no, my son helped me to do it. And I was like, I think I can download this on app. So I got that far, but really, I am good. I'm looking into getting something. It's almost like, for me, NFT personally, I view them as, I guess, in a way, prints or multiples editions in, you know, since I'm in that sector. But Elaine said, no, it's not. Okay. So, okay, she's going to give me 101 on that. So anyway.
But I think it's important we participate, because as you said, it really helps us connect with the next generation. When I went to open my Discord, the Discord said, your email has already been registered. And I thought, no, I've never registered on it. And then it turns out it was my 10-year-old daughter who had already used my email to register herself on Discord because she does not have her own email. But the point being, when I you know, I was angry at her, but still, I think I was also secretly pleased because I could tell that she was rather impressed that I want to go on Discord. So anyway.
I don't know, maybe Adrian, have you bought NFT?
No, I haven't bought NFT, and UBS, and we are a bit cautious on the whole crypto market, or of course, in the sense of you have to be very aware of what you're buying. And also I think the whole market, particularly when it comes to cryptocurrency, runs the risk that it gets regulated and it will have a big impact. But I do think what we are very fond of, and we are spending a lot of time on doing research, is a whole blockchain technology. And I do think that can revolutionize a lot of things, but like NFTs. Also, we will see, I mean, we already see a lot of, discussed that, the big shift in terms of spending through online, buying art online, and using the blockchain technology for different things, particularly for the art market, is probably a very interesting area that actually could be a major trend over the next couple of years. And as you said, we see millennials, of course, also coming to us with more requests for the whole digital space, crypto space, and blockchain technology, and they want to have solutions. And I do think this is something that probably doesn't go away that quickly, and is growing over time. And I mean, based on our survey, we see that in countries like Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, more than 60%, up to 70% of people intending actually to buy digital art this year in 2022. And so I think these trends, they will stay with us, and it has become a huge industry, of course.
I might just add as well, I think this is more from a kind of a macro perspective, but I think, you know, what might make Elaine not put her retirement plan in there quite yet as well, it's just that the difference in how this market's developing. And if you look in 2020, first of all, like the global survey showed that only about 5 or 6% of dealers in the traditional art market are in NFTs at the moment. So it is a kind of, it's not fully engaging there, but there's so much sales going on outside. And in those outside platforms, if you look in 2020, about 70% of the sales of NFTs were primary sales. So people making and launching new NFTs. And then if you look at 2021, it reversed completely. I think it was nearly 3/4 of the sales were resales, so things turning over. And it was an amazing thing. We covered them a little bit in the report, that it is extremely speculative. On average, art-based NFTs were bought and resold within about a month. That was a 30-day period, just over a month. And the average resale period in the art market, when you look at the auction sector, is about 30 years. So it is a hugely speculative market. It's not just people creating a lot of stuff and launching it out there. It's people speculating on a rise in the value of things that are being changing hands through secondary collecting and secondary sales. So I think it's really interesting, but there's a lot of issues, and it's been great for drawing new people in. But I think the interest has been, as Elaine said, more about where money's being made, probably, and it's in kind of crypto than necessarily in all cases in the artworks themselves. But there is really interesting applications in the traditional market too for funding projects, and we're doing all kinds of things. So it is, there's a lot of things going on, and it kind of, once this speculative thing dies down, I mean, it can't keep up. The NFT on these external platforms went from under 5 million in 2019 to 11 billion in 2021, the value of sales. So, I mean, it can't keep going on that trajectory. Something probably has to stabilize at least. The art-based ones were 3 billion. This is outside the market in 2021. So, I think we probably will see things settle down, and then you start to see the interesting things coming out in terms of how can we use these to fund projects and to bring out the public good aspects of artworks and things like that. So it's a really interesting area for sure.
Right. But then also speaking of sort of speculation and all these external effects that that have an impact on the market. 2021 obviously was, it was positive in terms of growth, and everything sort of seemed to be coming back. But now I know there's like some concerns in terms of the pandemic is still ongoing. There's a war, there's inflation. How do you guys, if at all, do you see them impacting the trends and observations that we've just discussed, in particular, obviously, spending levels and patterns?
Maybe I can kick it off from a macro perspective, sure. I do think, I'm doing this now with Clare a couple of years back, and it's also interesting to see, I mentioned this already earlier, but interesting to see that growth patterns regionally also are then reflected in the art market. And last year, as you mentioned, we have seen this huge rebound, and Clare mentioned it already, but it also comes at the back of the biggest recession we had in 2020. And so 2021 is now shaping up to be much more complicated from a growth level, particularly here in Asia, because we see that the world becomes less synchronized. So in China still having lockdowns, and we are actually revising downwards consistently our GDP numbers for China as these lockdowns getting extended, which we originally also didn't expect. And so China probably growing with 4% will also most likely be a reflection then also in what's the trend in the art market. While we see in Singapore and other smaller economies which have opened up, and particularly also versus Europe have opened up, which produce much stronger growth data. And I think that will start to impact also, and will probably show up in some of the sales numbers. But then we also have a probably very interesting constellation we have a very high inflation globally as well. And we start to see that people are looking to store some of their wealth into certain goods. Now, we in UBS, decided we are a bank and a financial institute, we don't advocate basically art as a store of value per se, because we really do think that if you want to engage in art, and UBS itself is a big art collector, that it should have an emotional value, why you buy it, not why you build your collection. But I do think we will start to see more people trying to probably look into collectibles arts. We have just seen I think the most expensive car have been bought over the last couple of days, that people will spend more, and the inflationary environment will probably encourage a lot of people to put their assets away out of cash into certain goods. And I could particularly expect that in the higher segment on the art market will be a big reflection out of that, because unfortunately the high inflation and the trends we see globally also leads to sort of this wealth gap, which is still increasing, and the inequality. And I do think that it's particularly the upper segment that will probably benefit more out of this situation, which we will then see how going forward governments will react differently to that, and will probably create taxes and so on. But it's definitely a key trend we currently monitor.
I was going to say exactly what Adrian said about this wealth gap that we're seeing, and then I do expect that it'll get much more evident and continue to widen this gap. And when I think about that, unfortunately, I think a lot of galleries who are working at a much lower priced, not necessarily the up and coming, rising or discovering young artists, but in between those middle section of the galleries who are working in the middle range of the pricing, I think we would face quite a lot of challenges, because those artworks are typically bought because they have specific following for specific artists for what they make, and therefore the buyers are emotionally attached to it. And the reason why the very top end of market is doing well is because, yes, you can buy something at that price, first of all, but it is also investment. It has an investment value, and therefore it seems to be less risk for the buyers, and they may not be as attached as those who are buying the lower value works in the middle section of the offerings. So yeah, we just have to continue working really hard.
Thank you for that, both of you. So we actually had some questions from the audience in the Q&A, and some of them have to, are very much relevant to exactly what we're addressing right now. And there's a question by Wim Bort, which is also about inflation. And so he's asking, do you expect the moment inflation is back to normal, like a sellout of art? And if yes, do you expect a drop in selling prices due to a then increased offer?
Sorry, Adrian can probably answer the stuff on inflation much better, and is kind of keeping a track on it. I think there's been so many studies on the effects on the art market that you can find a paper that gives you the answer you want in terms of the effects of inflation on the art market. But you have to remember the art market is a very supply-driven marketplace. So increases in supply don't necessarily cause a drop in the art market at all. Increases in supply can cause the market to go up. It's people are literally, with that thing that I said, NFTs turn over every month. So you might get a supply issues there, but with the art market, people are waiting 30 years for work to come onto the market again. So if there's an increase in supply, people are literally waiting in the wings for things to come onto the market. So it's supply can actually, very contrary to other markets, supply can drive prices upwards. It's completely the opposite kind of economics to other industries. So it doesn't necessarily work that way at all. Supply can enhance the market, depending on what that supply is, of course. But there is very varied effects we've seen, from the art being a kind of a safe haven, as Adrian says, to how it might affect kind of margins and corporate margins. So it might be bad for the more middle to high level people who are really important in the art market. That the high end kind of is slightly isolated from everything that goes on, and it's helped the market over the last couple of years. But what the market needs is more, as Emmy was saying, the more middle to high people, and they will be the ones that are feeling the crunch at the moment. I think from certainly here in Europe, from inflation, people can't afford to do anything because the inflation's been so rapid over the last 6 months. So, but I mean, I do think it doesn't follow the same rhythm that other markets have. So supply doesn't necessarily mean a drop in prices or a drop in sales.
I mean, I also want to kind of clarify that when we talk about art market, us who are in this profession, it's the auction house result does not reflect the entire art market. What art market is what Clare every year reports of the entire cross from the lower to middle to high-end galleries that's the art market. And so oftentimes I do think that especially people in this part of the world, they would just look at the auction as the art market, but that I think that is not. I believe that is not, and it is not. Okay.
Well, I think just pure economic is spoken. We do think that inflation will roll over the next couple of months. We see interest rates going up, and which probably also has an effect on the art market itself. But we actually do think that inflation will stay elevated probably for a longer period, and we're probably not going back to where we have been from 2010 to 20, where we virtually have no inflation. And so some inflation is actually positive, and what we don't expect is that inflation sort of rolls over into deflation, because that would be probably the toxic environment where people would question basically on particularly on the art market side. It would have an impact on the macroeconomic side. But if inflation just rolls over, it just means that prices will not increase as much. Probably macroeconomic environment is still quite healthy and basically supportive for the art market, and therefore we would be not expecting that a rollover inflation is something negative. I'd probably even say it's probably something positive for the broader market itself.
Elaine, did you have something to add? I feel like you were going to say something.
No, I actually feel that Claire, Emmy, and Adrian have covered this very well, and I'm leaving best to leave that question to the economists.
So with Art Basel Hong Kong coming up next week, this is the last question for me personally, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. But with Art Basel Hong Kong coming up, what is your outlook for the city as an art market, as an art hub, and also within the local market?
I'm very happy to speak about this one because I think I'm the only Hong Kong local on this panel. I am incredibly optimistic about Hong Kong's future as Asia's art hub. I think there's been a long tradition. I mean, Art Basel has certainly played a very important role, but Hong Kong's kind of status as an art hub predates that. The major auction houses, Christie's, Sotheby's, have been here 3-4 decades. And a big part of it is China is still, as Claire's report shows, the biggest market by far in Asia. And so wherever that is going to be, the great art hub in Asia is going to be somewhere that can engage with the China market easily. I also think that the other thing is, Hong Kong's certainly gone through a bit of turbulence in recent years, pandemic aside even, but I actually feel that there's no doubt that when you live in interesting times, that's when interesting art is going to come along. The pandemic certainly is, to the extent that the pandemic is impacting everything, certainly it does. It's caused a more fragmented market. I think the art fair, for example, Taipei Dangdai now, or say the ones in Seoul, these regional fairs right now suddenly have kind of a new relevance because many people in this area of the region still can't travel quite as freely as before. However, I believe that that is temporary. I think things are certainly moving in the right direction now. Most of my friends have either, it's gone from maybe 6 months ago, most people just have not left at all, to people who have either taken a trip or are going to take a trip this summer. And it's continuing to move in the direction of shorter quarantines, maybe abolishing it soon. So I feel that the pandemic, the pandemic's effect overall on the art market has been quite limited. I think in the first half of 2020, it looked like the whole world was going to stop, that the art market was going to halt. But instead, what's just happened is we've just all learned how to operate kind of, on a different way, adjusting to a new normal. And the market bounced back very, very quickly. So I believe the same will come with Hong Kong's status as an art hub. The tax advantages, the geographic advantages, the proximity to China, both culturally and geographically, are just too great. And one more thing, besides for the art market, where it's doing so well, the institutions here in Hong Kong are also going through major changes with M+ that just opened last year, the Hong Kong Palace Museum that is opening up, which all go to reinforce the ecosystem here into one that's very strong. And I think what's great about Hong Kong is, on the one hand, it is a great hub for the art market, but on the other hand, it also has a very strong local market that's incredibly sophisticated. So thank you, Art Basel, for being here. Sorry.
It's okay. Thank you. So I'm just going to move on to questions from the audience now. There's a question it's an anonymous question for Claire. Do you think, does she include China in the Asia column, even if China stands separately as its own data set? And how does she deal with Asia's different regional markets? How do you deal with China, Asia's different regional markets? Oh, Claire, I think your microphone.
Apologies. So I would deal with Asia. When I was talking about Asia, I was talking about the sum of all the markets. So China is definitely included in there. You know, we have good coverage where coverage is gaining all the time in all of the different markets, particularly in China, Japan, Korea, Singapore. You know, some of the markets in Indonesia and stuff, we have less coverage, but we're improving all the time. So we deal with China as part of Asia. It's obviously the biggest market. It's by far kind of dominates, and it's the same with this global pie. I mean, the other section is a very small slice, and it contains so many different countries. It's just in terms of the value of sales, they have really important and dynamic local markets, but both the price points and the aggregated value of sales is relatively low when you compare them to the US or even the UK. That they don't necessarily feature that well. And I think just following up on Elaine's point, you know, these hubs are so dominant because they get it right on a few different things. They have the wealth base, they have the regulatory infrastructure that attracts sales, and they also have the cultural infrastructure. And I think I'm just amazed still how important the regulatory and tax situation is in places. And I think this is where Hong Kong you know, it gets it right, and why it will retain sales. And it's the reason why sales left Paris years ago and things like that, because they messed up on the regulatory side. So I think that's a very strong point for Hong Kong. But that's why when you see those pies, they're so dominant in the US, UK, and China. It's because these are the countries where wealth is dominant. You know, the regulatory situation is a certain way, and they attract sales, and also they have the cultural infrastructure. And the US particularly gets it right, definitely on all those three, but Hong Kong also.
Right. Thank you. There's another anonymous question, and it's kind of for Emmy, but I think almost anyone can, maybe other panelists have insights to this. So Emmy mentioned that the reason why the top art market is doing well is because of the higher value attached. What would be your advice for up and coming creative brands and artists to break through this wealth gap to be able to be noticed?
Well, I mean, to be noticed in the art world today, it's really competitive. I mean, we know that. But what really kind of enabled, I think, for some of the artists who kind of came onto the fore is the development of Instagram and the other apps that we're using now to really capture the attention of not only the galleries or museum professionals, but also just general public. But I do think fundamentally, if you want to be noticed as up and coming artists, you have to make sure that the quality is there. I think that's the most important thing. Not sure if I addressed the question right, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, I think so.
I really agree with Emmy about the importance of social media. I think there's this romantic idea of an artist where you just create kind of in isolation, and, you know, maybe someone will discover you, but you do not engage with the world. This like hermit idea. I think that is, for better or worse, less relevant now. I think now to be an artist, yes, you obviously you have to work with a great gallerist. The quality of your work has to be good, but so much of it does have to do with kind of, I hate to say this, kind of playing the game and navigating the system. So, and social media is a big part of it, but not the only part. Also building your networking and making sure you are kind of, you and your works of your practice are turning up at the right places, etc.
Right.
A lot of young artists getting noticed. Sorry, I know if I jump in here. It's also how as artists, you're in an artist community and artists help each other. And I see that a lot, especially in the last 2 years, really the young artists getting together, really collaborating, not necessarily on the works themselves, but really creating much larger impact as an artist community of a sort. So I do think that if you are in the right community with people that you feel comfortable with and then you click with, I think that is also very important that you should not ignore.
Right. And that's actually absolutely like a huge trend with having sort of a collective and communal effort. I mean, if anything, we're going to see that at Documenta with Wrong Grupa curating that, which is totally the opposite spectrum of the art market, but I do think it's important. So here's another question. This is probably the last question from the audience. This is from Brady Ng. A question for anyone, but mostly Claire. With more artists experimenting with NFTs and auction houses taking on some NFTs, do you expect to devote resources to tracking blockchain transactions to monitor this, or do you expect the art NFT market bubble to pop?
We are definitely, we did it in the report this year. I kept it separate from traditional art, the traditional market I was kind of measuring. So we did do it as a separate section, but I mean, I can't, you know, it's just, there was such interest in it, it's hard to ignore. But, you know, I suppose that one particular report that I published with Art Basel every March focuses on gallery and auction sales. That's the remit of that report. You know, I think it would be really interesting to cover this area, you know, as a whole separate thing. And maybe I'm going to have to face that kind of horrible puzzle of putting them all together at one stage. Just when you do that, you have to put together artist sales directly to people in other ways as well. So commissions and everything like that too. So that's a giant can of worms that I'm going to have to deal with at some stage. But, you know, at the moment, you know, as I said, the NFTs in terms of the traditional art market were a fairly low share of sales. Only 5 or 6% of the galleries we surveyed had sold any in 2021. But I think that will change. And we will keep monitoring with other researchers as well that we're working with what's happening on those separate platforms. So we'll do both. And I do think it's very, very speculative. I don't know if it'll pop or it'll kind of come down. But with those turnarounds, when I saw that resale length of time, I was like jaw dropped. You know, 30 days is the average time somebody holds on to an NFT for. So with that kind of behavior, you do expect something to give. Some catalytic event will happen. You know, it might be related to crypto or it might be something completely different. Everyone will rush for liquidity at the same time. So you do expect some kind of something might give, but you know, I could be proved completely wrong too. So.
All right. Who knows with NFTs right now? It's just a guessing game. Thank you everyone for joining us today. A huge thank you to our panelists, to Claire, Elaine, Adrian, and Emmy for joining us today and participating in this wonderful conversation. We look forward to seeing you all soon.